Good afternoon, everyone. It brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome to each one of you for the another enriching session of the ICS Wednesday Seminar. My name is Bhagyeshi Nimbalkar and I am Research Intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. I am honored to serve as the Master of Ceremony for today's event. I extend a warm welcome to each one of you who have joined us. The title for today's seminar is The China Coast Guard Interpreting Its Evolving Structures. The China Coast Guard has in recent years seen a rapid restructuring in its infrastructure, equipment, vessel, and command and control structure to address perceived challenges in evolving security scenarios in the region. Major reforms were initiated in 2013, which brought an end to the era of five dragons and integrated them under overall command of the State Council. Consequently, in the 2018, the People's Armed Police Force, which comes under the command of the Central Military Commission, took over command of the CCG. Simultaneously, emphasis has also laid on strengthening and modernizing the maritime militia, an institution with peculiarity, particularly in terms of its capabilities and infrastructure for command and control. In this edition of the Wednesday seminar, we will discuss the evolving structures of CCG, the rationale underlying these changes, and interlinkages with the People's Liberation Army Navy. The speaker for today's session is Dr. Vikash Kumar Thakur. His area of expertise is in the field of international relations, specializing in East Asian studies. He holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University on China Coast Guard and its regional dynamics, 2002 to 2017. Dr. Thakur completed his M.Phil focusing on China Coast Guard and its maritime defense 2000 to 2016. Dr. Thakur's research interests encompass maritime law enforcement agencies, security and geopolitical issues prevalent in East Asia. The chair of the session, Dr. Atul Bhardwaj, is currently fellow, Pradhan Mantri Museum and Library, New Delhi. He is also honorary fellow at School of International Studies, University of London. He is an adjunct fellow in the Institute of Chinese Studies. He is the author of India-America Relation 1942 to 1962. He writes a regular strategic affairs column in the Economic and Political Weekly, Mumbai. Before I hand over it to hand it over to Dr. Bhardwaj, I would request all participants to adhere to some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. You may post your questions in the chat box. Alternatively, you may use the raise hand option during the interactive session. After the presentations, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. Please remember to mention your name and affiliation while posting your question. Now I hand over floor to the chair to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Bhageshri, for giving excellent introduction to the whole seminar. And welcome, Dr. Thakur. And we are very eagerly waiting to listen to your talk today because it's a very topical issue. And especially with East and South China Sea becoming hotspots over the years, and China flexing its muscle in the area, frequently flexing its muscle in the area. And, one sees the Chinese Coast Guard as an extension of its navy, which is now one of the largest navies in the world. So therefore, it's very topical, very important to learn about the Coast Guard because, many of the debates which circle around Navy, we generally tend to ignore the role of the Coast Guard, which is very crucial, especially in the troubled waters of South China Sea and East China Sea. The neighbors, of course, are worried, like Philippines and Taiwan are really worried about this policing operations which are carried out by Coast Guard in their waters. So let's now, I won't say much on this because I don't know much on this. We have an expert, and I'll hand over the floor to Dr. Thakur, take us through to this entire evolution of the Chinese Coast Guard. Over to you, Dr. Thakur.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Atul Bhardwaj. Good afternoon to all of you. I thank I giving me this opportunity, this wonderful opportunity to speak on the topic I have worked on. So the topic of today's seminar is the Chinese Coast Guard interpreting its administrator. So the talk will proceed the following way. First, we will discuss the structure which existed prior to 2013. Then discuss what are the changes which were took place in 2013, the structure which existed from 2000 to 18, 2013 to 18, and the change which was introduced in 2018. In the second section, we will discuss about the the approaches. How do we approach this change? How do we see it? Later on, if we have time left, we will discuss about the regional dynamics of this whole region, including East China Sea and South China Sea. What are the regional dynamics which led to certain change? And then we will discuss about the maritime militia. As I have mentioned, it is very peculiar in its nature. So coming on to the first topic which we have today is what was the structure of maritime law enforcement agencies which existed prior to 2013. So basically, there were five different maritime law enforcement agencies which worked in which work for law enforcement in South China Sea and East China Sea. First one was Maritime Police of China, which came under dual command of MPS, that is Ministry of Public Security, and PAPF. PAPF is People Armed Police Force, which comes under the command of Central Military Commission. So it was under maritime police was under dual command. The second structure which existed was FNDC, is also known as Fisheries Law Enforcement Command, which functioned under Fisheries Management Bureau under Ministry of Agriculture. The third one was Central Maritime Surveillance, which functioned under SOA, that is State Oceanic Administration, which overall came under the Ministry of Land and Agriculture, Land and Resource. Sorry. The the third was Custom Police, which functioned under General Administration of Customs under the Ministry of Public Security. And the last one was Maritime Safety Administration. Maritime Safety Administration functioned under Ministry of Transport. All of them were assigned and authorized to function according to their mandate. Like, for example, Fisheries Law Enforcement was commissioned or authorized to govern the areas and see if illegal fishing is not being done, or fishing which is done is as per the law. In the same way, Ministry of Maritime Safety Administration, which came under Ministry of Transport, had its function of regulating the traffic via sea lanes of communication and in the is EZ, that is economic zone, exclusive economic zone, and within the territorial sea. In 2013, under a program started by State Council of China named State Council Institutional Reforms and Functional Reformation Plan. So in this plan in 2013, four of these five structures, four of these five maritime law enforcement agencies, namely Maritime Police of China, Fisheries Law Enforcement Command, Central Maritime Surveillance, and Custom Police, were merged under one authority, and this merger together was termed as China Coast Guard. This functioned under state. It was brought under SOA, State Oceanic Administration. Earlier, there was only one of this MLE under SOA, but now all these four clubbed in together as CCG and brought under SOA, State Oceanic Administration, which came under Ministry of Land and Resource. The last one, which was Maritime Safety Administration, which was under Ministry of Transport. This was not merged into CCG. It was taken that the nature of work which Maritime Safety Administration did was quite different. It was related to free passage of ships and cargo vessels and all that. So it was not brought under it. So from 2013 to 2018, this system, more or less, this system was basically functional. All the four which I mentioned were merged in one under and named as CCG. This was in 2013. CCG came as a separate entity under SOA. In 2018 we get to see another change, and that was the CCG, which was earlier functioning under SOA and Ministry of under the command of Ministry of Land and Resource, was transferred under the PAPF, that is People Armed Police Force, which functioned under CMC, under Central Military Commission. So basically what change took place is the CG, which earlier was given instruction or function under the command of a civilian agency, that is Ministry of Land and Resource, was Central Military Commission. Central Military Commission linkages whatsoever to any civilian functioning. So now CCG would not receive any command related to civilian agencies only, and it would receive command from the Central Military Commission, which is a military organization. So how do we approach this change? How do we see this restructuring process? The overall restructuring, if we go in back in time, so, we find in 2000 in 2000 the defense white paper for first time mentioned about bringing a collaboration between military and civil authorities to uh, manage the land and sea border. So in 2000 in 2000 was taken that both the civil and military should work together to administer the land and sea, and from this it started that there has to be brought in the civilian law enforcement agencies, maritime law enforcement agencies, to make it more effective. And then in 2005 China started, from 2005 we get to see that China started to bring its people liberation army navy in the background. Now any, if any kind of dispute arised, or there is face off with the coast guard or any other ship from other littoral states, namely maybe Japan, Korea, or Indonesia, or Vietnam, or the Philippines. So here what we get to see after 2005, the PLAN, which earlier was first line of defense, now it came back in the background. It now its work was just to coordinate all these, since there were 5 different agencies. So its work was mainly confined to coordinating between all of these. So from 2000 it started. 2005 PLAN came in the background, and and then the reorganization, after 2005 we come to 2013, which I explained, that the change was started of clubbing this all of this together. The major problem which the leadership, or let's say the government of China faced, was the lot of resource was being invested, and there was also overlapping jurisdiction between all of this, and lot of resource was being invested due to separate facilities being developed for all of them. The maritime police would have its own facilities to be developed. Then the fisheries law enforcement command will have its own setup. In the same way was with the custom police and others. So one that there were lot of agencies working in the same area. There was overlapping command, like the same area has to be governed by different number of agencies. So there was also, either there was too much of policing, or some areas were left with no policing. So, and what started in 2005 and in 2000 and 2005, that the civilian and military has to combine, and for this the civilian authorities have to be strengthened, and which I can say that it all clubbed in together to bring the reform of 2013. But the reform which was started in 2013 did not have had the same amount of impact or same amount of results which the leadership and other sectors envision from this reform. Again, even if Coast Guard was functioning under SOA, State Oceanic Administration, under Ministry of Land and Resource, still had to receive some functional guidelines from Ministry of Public and Security. Again, there were not very clear distinctions marked in this field, and so this was a problem. Again, in 2016, there were reforms carried out in PLA. People Liberation Army overall in all the wings. It was Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard, and all other wings. Certain steps were taken at organizational level. It was done to corruption. And it has also been seen as anti-corruption drive, or large section of the PLA was also demobilized. So certain steps were taken, and then it was finalized that in order to make Coast Guard mm, more strong and more functionable in the area, we need to have a clear jurisdiction of command. The infrastructure of command which existed, as I mentioned earlier, was had two different ministries suggesting to or under which the Coast Guard had to function. So it was now finally in 2018 brought under CMC. So these are the few reasons which we see led to such change. Again, there are also further approaches to it. For example, for China, let's the what Robert D. Putnam says is a two-level game, where the leadership has to gain his legitimacy from the domestic sphere also. In China, the Communist Party has faced several uh, distrust, not distrust, but kind of, if the Chinese defense force, or let's say the Chinese executive agency which are working on for the international borders, whether it is Navy, Army, or any other thing, if they have if they receive certain kind of setback from the other navies or Coast Guard or anyone, for example, Japan or Philippines or any other country, and which happened. So there was a huge uproar in country regarding it, that the Chinese leadership has let the country down, or certain things related to it, that we need to strengthen our defense forces in order to tackle the growing challenges in security. So this also uh, push the leadership to uh, strengthen the Coast Guard. So, but in order to gain legitimacy, or to put in front of people that uh, China does not takes on any defeat from any other country lightly. So the reforms were also carried out for this, uh, to overcome this fear. The another important thing was the resources. The resources present in South China Sea resource claims of sovereignty in the disputed regions, like disputed group of islands like Spratly, Paracel, or Scarborough Shoal, and others. These are also very important claims. So in order to counter such narratives of UN, of other countries, these were certain changes were being brought up. So now coming on to the third last section, which is regional dynamics. When we talk about regional dynamics, there are certain other littoral states like uh, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. During the same period, that is from 2000 onwards, what we get to see is that there are lot of disputes going on between these countries, and of all the disputes, two-third of the disputes which happened in this region, Coast Guard was involved in most of them. At least in two-third conflicts, Coast Guard was involved. And looking into all of this, there were what is that, from 2000 onwards, the reforms were carried out in all of these countries. Whether it is Coast Guard of Japan was not allowed to carry firearms on board of the ship, on board of the vessel. But later on in early 2000, the Coast Guard of Japan was also carry firearms. This is the same period during which reforms were being started into the Chinese Coast Guard. In the same way, if we see the Philippine Coast Guard, the structure of Philippine Coast Guard also went through change. The Philippine Coast Guard earlier used to function as a part of Philippines Navy, but during the same period in 2009, Philippine Coast Guard was brought under Department of Transport and Communication to streamline its command and control structure. Again, the amount of investment or amount of fund which was being allotted to the Coast Guard in the region, in all of these countries, shows a spike in the during the same period. In 2014, when Benigno Aquino was the president of Philippines, he also mentioned this thing in his speech, that we need to counter the growing influence of other 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 coast guard or other naval powers in the region. During the same period, the Philippine Coast Guard tried to develop good relations with the Japanese Coast Guard, whether it was for training purpose, whether it was in the exchange of cadets from both the sides. So in this way, in this way, the Coast Guard in all of the littoral states uh, tried to reform or restructure their Coast Guard during the same period. The Japanese Coast Guard, for the first time in 2013 or so, tried. Earlier, the head of the Japanese Coast Guard used to be a bureaucrat, or from Maritime Self Defense Force, or high official from Maritime Self Defense Force. But during this year 2013 onwards, we get to see that the Japanese Coast Guard head was now a personnel who was trained in the newly formed schools, or in training schools, training academies for the Japanese Coast Guard. So training schools were also opened, and now the head of Japanese Coast Guard from 2013 onwards or 15 onwards were being made from the Japanese Coast Guard cadets itself. During the same time, we also get to see that earlier the president or any high officials didn't come to the passing out parade of the Japanese Coast Guard cadets, but from 2015 onwards, when Shinzo Abe was there, it was started as it was they started to the president used to go to the passing out parade for the for the Coast Guard cadets of Japan. In the same way, during the same period from 2002 onwards, the to Korean Coast Guard also shows some similar, like Korean Coast Guard Academy was opened in 2004. Korean National Maritime Police Agency was created in 2007, and so on. During this period, we see that a lot of changes are being are taking place in the region, in aspect of maritime law enforcement agencies, not only in the Chinese Coast Guard's thing, but like I mentioned, in Japanese Coast Guard, Philippines Coast Guard, they were trying to strengthen their Coast Guard, their respective Coast Guards, either by streamlining them or opening academies or giving more importance. Like I mentioned, the president usually didn't to the passing out periods, but now we see after 2015 it started to go. In fact, Japan also used its ODA in a way to align its interest in this field. ODA it tried to invest its ODA in such a way that it aligns with the interest of strengthening its maritime law enforcement agencies. In the same way, the Vietnam also started to allow the Vietnamese Coast Guard officials to use firearms on board if someone suspected did not adhere to the commands or so. From 2008, from 2018, separate training centers were opened, and so on. Changes were being brought. So the regional dynamics was there. Like I mentioned, the regional dynamics I explained now. It was not just that the Coast Guard of China was going through the change. During this same period, the Japanese Coast Guard and other Coast Guard also will change. Going through the reasons why this restructuring took place in the Chinese Coast Guard, apart from sovereignty, resources present in South China Sea, and the claims made by different parties, the regional dynamics also played a very important role. And the fourth reason which I mentioned was the nationalist aspirations in these countries. Whenever there was any setback in the maritime domain due to lack of coordination between agencies, since multiple agencies existed and which still exist in some of these countries. Vietnam or Philippines still has 4 different agencies working. Vietnam also has 4 different agencies working in maritime domain. So if there were setback in at the sea, the leadership had to face very strong reaction in their country, in the domestic level. So they had to take such steps to strengthen the coast guard. Talking about China's coast guard and maritime law enforcement agencies, there is also a peculiar set of force which has been termed as maritime militia. Maritime militia has a very different different background or different approach as compared to other other naval forces or other maritime law enforcement agencies. The maritime militia of China basically functions as they are basically civilians who can be enrolled into the state sponsored fishing, not exactly fishing, but state sponsored. They have state sponsored ship, they have state sponsored training, they go through indoctrination and training provided by people liberation army, navy and others. And they now function as a part of the navy, not exactly like they have some streamlined chain of command or streamlined infrastructure developed in them. But the PLA Navy and Coast Guard do provide them with basic training, with basic training, and also provide them with arms and equipments to function in the disputed zones, which are also known as gray zones in the South China Sea and East China Sea. The maritime militia origin goes back to 1920, when when the leadership in China was going through a rapid change and was going through a internal contestation between two different groups in China. So during this time, the concept of militia emerged when the leadership tried to have, apart from army, group of certain loyals or group of certain people who are not in army to align with align with the supreme leader or so. And during the era of Mao Zedong, impe- uh, during 1950s, the era of Mao Zedong, the leadership focused a lot on strengthening the concept of militia. The rhetorics like to defeat the imperial forces and such were used. But the concept since late 1970s, China started to emphasize more on aspects or more on economic aspect. And so the maritime militia, during this period, the maritime militia uh, didn't exactly had a setback, but the importance which it had in 1950s during Mao Zedong era started to diminish. But again in 2010 or so, 2010, the importance of maritime militia again start to increase, and the strengthening started to take place. Is- um, the maritime strengthening started during Xi Jinping's era. The maritime militia has also been strengthened with active support of PLA Navy. They have been trained and facilitated in the area. The rationale behind strengthening of maritime militia uh, and other maritime law enforcement agencies, excluding CCG, apart from China Coast Guard, PLA Navy, and maritime militia, there are other forces as well as of now from the side of People's Republic of China, functioning in the South China Sea in the gray zone, in East China Sea in the gray zone. They have been more streamlined and strengthened. So they 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 do not receive commands directly from the PLA Navy or Coast Guard, but they have functional guidelines receiving from the Coast Guard. The maritime militia, the merit the maritime militia loosely, as it has not been very much strengthened as of now, and the command and control structure is weak. So there have been added advantage the government of China or government of People's Republic of China and the authorities there, that they can go in those areas and still any any kind of war which can happen, or any kind of skirmish which can happen between between two nation states or states is if there is a conflict between militia and other coast of other countries, it is not seen as the conflict between two countries, because maritime militia like I mentioned previously, maritime militia are not directly part of defense system. They are just provided training and equipments, ship vessels to go for fishing or go to strengthen the claims of China in disputed and gray zones. Since they don't have any direct relation to state defense system, so the conflict if maritime militia has with the maritime law enforcement agencies of other countries is not seen as a conflict between two different countries. But at the same time, the claims of China are being strengthened, and they are trained by state. So if we say that they are not, or can we say that they are part of state, it functions as a gray zone and still remains in a very different kind of, it had a very different kind of image, that whether we consider it as a part of defense system in the country overall, or not. As of now, they are not very streamlined, and the major problem which arises is that how the amount of personnel or amount of fishermen, do we call them fishermen or personnel, but they are in huge numbers. So does PLA Navy or Coast Guard has direct control on them, which they which they don't have? But Chinese sources, the Chinese journals or articles or authorities, they mention that we do have direct control over them. But from the other side, we get to know that it is not possible to have direct control over such huge numbers. And since they function in very far-flung areas, and they have equipments and other things provided by the state, but they don't have very sophisticated weapons or communication system with them. So how do we see them? The Japanese or the US government have already mentioned that the way militia functions is very deceptive in nature. You cannot completely ignore their functioning, since they have huge number and they do stand claims of China. But when you try to engage with them, they are also not part of the state. So this is what the maritime militia is. It has also been seen in the way the during era, during the struggle era before 1949, the way there was huge participation of people, or let's say the imperial war was also, the war against imperial powers are also termed as the people's war. The participation of civilians who can opt in or opt out of the maritime militia, they can go in and they can also leave it as per their wish. So it has also been seen as as a step by the government to bring in more and more people. It's a people war, it's a people's war, like it used to happen. So this is of maritime militia. And the regional dynamics I mentioned previously. So the reform structure, I explained, and the rationale behind the rationale and the reasons why steps were taken to reform the structure, and the regional dynamics and the maritime militia also. So now I close my talk here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vikas, and for giving us such a wonderful exposition of what is happening in the China's coastal areas, and how they're shaping, how their coastal defense is shaping up, and the consequences of it for the rest of the world as such. Maritime militia, which is a very important aspect because the Chinese are also exploring not just with the state bodies but also with the non-state actors, and these non-state actors are, then going to be, in times of crisis, we've seen in even the merchant ships would become a part of their war effort. So, the maritime militias are used for spying, are used for various activities even now. And in the times of actual crisis, they're going to be absolutely amalgamated into the whole maritime ecosystem, the security ecosystem. Uh, Thank you so much. And, the house is open to questions. You can ask your questions. Please raise your hand or, uh, put it in the chat box, your questions, and I'm sure we'll get some fantastic answers.
So here is one question from in chat box posted by Ashutosh Vasistha. His question is, what are the similarities and differences in terms of structuring of the Indian and Chinese coast guards in light of recent developments such as the Maldives running towards China and the Indian Navy establishing INS Jaitu in Lakshadweep? What measures to be taken to strengthen our coast guard too? Thank you.
Where, if you can explain, Dr. Thakur, I would add to this that what is the sort of jurisdictional area for the Coast Guard, and is there a very clear-cut division between the Navy and the Coast Guard in terms of how far they will reach?
Yes, thank you for reading the question. So I would like to answer this question. The Chinese Coast, the difference between Indian and Chinese Coast Guard. First of all, Indian Coast Guard is a civilian agency. It is it is headed by did not directly or it does not receive command directly by the Ministry of Defense. It functions under the Ministry of Home, as far as I know, and the the officials, they are not trained under the military, like for, I would explain it. The defense personnel have a different training setup, like we have National Defense Academy or Indian Military Academy just for the defense set. But if you go for the civilian, it's there is a police academy, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Police Academy. So if someone is trained in, let's say, the National Defense Academy and IMA, they can be termed as a military personnel. But if someone is trained in the like Police Academy of Hyderabad, Sardar Vallabhbhai Police Academy. So they both have uh, different image. The one is considered as the civil police, and others is a military personnel. In the same way, if we go to the Chinese Coast Guard, the, the Chinese Coast Guard, most of the officials are from PLA Navy. They are retiring from, or they are either being demobilized and put into the Coast Guard. So if someone from directly from military is being placed at the top level or on the high officials, so how do you differentiate it from the functioning? The character would change. The way the Guard of India and Coast Guard of China, like I mentioned, this the officials which are at decision making level in the Chinese Coast Guard, are most of them have been demobilized from the PLA Navy to the Chinese Coast Guard. So this is the most basic difference. And the second one is that the Coast Guard which India has is, if you compare the amount of amount of personnel in both the places, like the Chinese Coast Guard and the Indian Coast Guard, you will find huge asymmetry. Their Coast Guard is biggest in world. The Chinese Coast Guard has vessels which are bigger than the vessels of bigger than the naval vessels of some countries. So the way the amount of disputes, amount of conflicts in which the Chinese Coast Guard are present, you will see that there is huge difference. Thank you.
one issue I would like to mention here, Dr. Thakur, that you mentioned that, although you mentioned it very correctly, that the Indian Coast Guard comes under the Indian Home Ministry, but there is it also is in terms of it training. It is really, it gets trained. It doesn't have its own academy as such, and it trains with the Indian Navy. And for a long time, the Indian Navy was providing it the officers, and but gradually over the years, we've trained a cadre of Coast Guard officers, and now you have the Director General of Coast Guard, who belongs to that Coast Guard cadre rather than coming from the Navy. But for quite some time, the naval officers were heading that, and there is a very close relationship between the Navy and the Coast Guard in the Indian context also, uh, because the nature of the work is quite similar in that sense. And so, in terms of ship handling, in terms of navigation, and other issues, they do collaborate with each other. Uh, but as you're saying, and not to the extent to which the Chinese are doing it, probably. And we are trying to, segregate the two gradually.
Yes, sir.
Any other question? If Dr. Thakur, if you could elaborate a little more on, how the Japanese are reacting uh, to the muscle flexing by the Chinese Coast Guard in the waters, and what countermeasures are they taking, and with regards to Taiwan also, how Taiwan is sort of reacting to these, muscle flexing by the Chinese Coast Guard. Of course,
Yes,
there were some
yes.
incidents, if you could mention some incidents which have happened recently between these Coast Guards.
Yes, Chair. I would answer this question. The Chinese Coast Guard and the Japanese Coast Guard has been in face of at certain points. They have disputed island, that is Senkaku Islands. So here they keep on having face off with each other at several times. The the policy papers, or the papers released by authorities in government, they have in recent part started to mention about, the Japanese side has started to mention in its papers and policy papers related to defense, that in the recent past, or in the changing dynamics of security in the sea and land, we have to be prepared for any kind of any kind of any kind of attack on our land from the seaside. And if someone tries to capture our or someone tries to hamper our, or someone tries to challenge our sovereign rights on the islands, we are ready to we have to be prepared for it. So basically they do not mention China directly, but but the way they mention, and the way they mention it clearly signifies that most probably they are talking about China. And number one, and number two, the recurring amount of such mentions has been increasing. So, and during the same period, the like I mentioned in the talk, that they have been they have been strengthening their coast guard in recent past. The coast guard law has been amended several times in 2000, in the era of late 2008 or 2009. The coast guard law has been changed, where the Japanese coast guard officials has now been allowed to on board the ship use firearms to attack someone, or apprehend someone. So the Japanese Coast Guard has also been increasing the number of personnel trained. They have been opening academies of Japan to train their Coast Guard separately. Earlier, they also had the similar facility which India had, like you mentioned, that they were trained with the Navy altogether. The same situation was there in the Japanese Coast Guard also, but now they have started to open academy. They have also tried to invite countries which have the countries which have disputes with China, or China is hostile to certain countries, they have tried to invite such countries, the Philippines Coast Guard cadets, to train in their own country, and they also have started exchange programs. So, as far as I see, the Japanese have. Um, the Japanese have also started to counter the influence of growing Chinese threat, if we can say so. And the Taiwanese side, I have not been through any readings or any such things from the Taiwanese Coast Guard, but I will see to it.
Any other questions? You're free to ask questions. Another issue that I would like you to, elaborate on, if you have come across any statistics on these issues. Do the Chinese, the Coast Guard, do they claim a lot of anti-smuggling activities that they are engaged in those Chinese waters close? And how efficient they are in that sense, how efficient they are considered by, the Chinese own authorities, or by what is the perception about the Chinese Coast Guard as such? Are they efficient? Are they efficient at doing the basic duties like, anti-narcotics and anti-smuggling? And are the incidents of such incidents more in these waters? Have you come across that? And the second question I would like to ask is about, uh, does the Chinese Coast Guard, participate in any joint exercises, bilateral or multilateral exercises, with the other Coast Guards in the region or otherwise?
Okay, thank you, Chair. The Chinese Coast Guard had, when there were other maritime law enforcement agencies, uh, there was a separate maritime law enforcement agency working in this direction, that was called Custom Police, which functioned under General Administration for Customs. There were a lot of smuggling activities going on in the region. I have been through the data, but as of now, I don't. I cannot recall it. But I read that there was huge amount of smuggling activities going on, and the it it was double loss to the state, because for number one, that the economy which can be generated, or which the resource which can be used for other things, was now being was now entering into China via other means. The state did not receive any revenue from that, number one. And number two, large amount of smuggling activities were being done, was of narcotics or skin of uh, animals which were illegal. So there were certain activities on smuggling going on, and the Chinese state authorities tried to curb it, and strengthening of custom police was also done, and later on the custom police was also merged in the Coast Guard. So this was the status of the smuggling in the region. And for joint activities, joint maritime exercises, or done by the Chinese Coast Guard, I I am not very sure, but maybe there was a joint exercise or between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Pakistani Navy or something like that, but I haven't come across any such things. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, this is quite
Hand
a.
raised by Rappai Malakal. Please proceed with
Yes,
your
please.
question.
Yes, Mr. Rapai, please proceed. Bhageshwari, do we have Mr. Rapai?
Him to ask question, but I didn't get any reply from him yet.
Yes, he's there. Um, Hi, Rapai, how are you? Please ask your question. Probably he's left. Is there any other question?
No,
Okay,
Atul,
you're here. Oh,
uh,
fantastic. Please ask a question.
it's partly a question and this thing, because he mentioned the one of the key difference which came to the Chinese Coast Guard is placing it under PAP and under the CMC command. It is now directly working, because earlier a lot of smuggling activity was in different areas of Hong Kong and other places used to take place. But now I think the PLA is not directly doing it, but through CMC and PAP. So I think that relation we need to place clearly, and their training and other issues coming under the command and control of the like the PAP is the, as you know, it is more used in the armed police. Even though armed police they term it, but it is a misnomer. But armed police is working very closely with the all the activities of the PFA, and now it is directly under the CMC. So I would like to get your comments on this training and everything. And a lot of mafia agencies used to be there, especially around the link to the business groups of Chinese merchants. And I think that smuggling activities partly because a lot of whenever China is put under the sanctions, they use this merchant groups also for their illegal activities or partly legal activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupai. You can answer the question, Dr. Thakur.
So the smuggling activities, like I mentioned, were there, and to curb these activities, steps were taken. There was, like I mentioned, smuggling of narcotics were there, smuggling of animal skins was being done there, and there were also lot of scuffle going on with the smugglers in this region. There was huge kind of loss of resource if we consider the smuggling part. So steps were taken to address it by the authorities, and there has been decline, as far as I know, in the smuggling activities in the region. And about the training and relation between Coast Guard and Navy, the PLA Navy as of now is not directly involved with uh, uh, not involved directly with CCG, but it comes via, since all of them function under overall command of Central Military Commission. So PLA Navy is related to Coast Guard via this direction. And exchange of the large number of vessels have been provided by the PLA Navy to Coast Guard for their functioning. Some ships have been refitted with the and the number of guns, or the intensity of guns which were there on the ships. They have been refitted, restructured according to the needs, or according to the amount of lethality of weapons which would be appropriate for Coast Guard. They have been done. So in this way, and the personnels are also being demobilized from PLA Navy to the Coast Guard. So in a way, Coast Guard and Navy via command and control structure, if we see, they are related by a Central Military Commission, and not directly related to each other. But in case of functionality, if we see, the PLA Navy now does not gets directly involved into any conflict. The PLA Navy as of now will be the second line. It will be in the second line. The first line would be administered or will be executed by the Chinese Coast Guard. In recent past, we have seen whether it was with Indonesia in 2000, with Vietnam in 2019, or with Philippines in 2018. The 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 PLA Navy did not directly go into the conflict. It was just uh, it was just as in the background, and was in providing for logistics and support to the Coast Guard functioning there. It was a long standoff, so if we see the role of PLA Navy, it has now been come to the background in the disputes in South China Sea, especially with the islands coming under 9 line. So this is how it has been as of now. Thank you.
Uh, any other questions?
By Ashutosh Vasishtha. Sir, recently a law passed in 2021 empowered the Chinese Coast Guard, Haching, to uh, fire on foreign vessels in 2001. So, by empowering the Coast Guard with much resources and power, could it lead to downgrade the role of Chinese Navy?
Nice question, but as far as I know, the strengthening of Coast Guard has does not has any direct impact on the Navy. Navy and Coast Guard, the functioning is very different. If we the area which is considered by China as its domestic area is the area under 9 line, the China claims that it is all this all belongs to China. The Coast Guard has to function inside this area. Whatever island or territory comes under this area, it will be administered, or any kind of if any sort of face off with navy with maritime law enforcement agencies of other countries happen in this area, it will be the Coast Guard. But if we have to go outside this, I think PLA Navy comes in function there. Navy has lot of other areas where it has to function, whether it is humanitarian assistance, if you have to provide, if you have to go, if you have to escort the ships to outside the region beyond Malacca Strait, or in the Indian Ocean, or any other region, whether it was in previously close to Gulf of Hormuz and others. So even if the Coast Guard is strengthened, I uh, I don't see that the relevance or strength of the PLA Navy is going to reduce, or it's going to impact negatively. They both have separate area of function. And but one thing I can say is that as of now it has been like this. But if situation changes, that the coast that the navies of other countries, if they, well, they cannot come at par with the Chinese PLAN. But if there is some kind of such threat arises, so there can be a change, maybe. But as of now, there is very uh, I don't see any negative impact on Chinese Navy, on the PLA Navy, even if the Coast Guard is being strengthened.
Another question by Akshat. Even when nations are engaged in a standoff, there is a certain threshold that is generally not crossed, a threshold that ends at the doorstep of outright war. By employing their coast guard instead of the plan, especially against the Japanese, uh, would you would you say that the Chinese are trying to escalate incrementally and exert pressure over the Japanese without crossing this threshold?
Thank you, Akshat, for the question. It's a very, very well framed question. So I would say it's a very interesting issue. That this is what the Coast Guard. This is where the importance of Coast Guard comes in. Uh, the basic role of the Coast Guard is to keep the intensity beyond control. If the navies of two different countries come at face off with each other, it will be seen as a war between two nations, or it will have a different meaning. But if the Coast Guard comes to at face off with each other, uh, the Coast Guard of two different countries, it will have a different image altogether. So even so, what the Coast Guard has been doing, or the authorities of China have been doing, they have been very aggressively countering the influence of any other nation states or any other littoral powers by using their Coast Guard. They have as per the claims by the other littoral states, the Chinese Coast Guard have been violating their sovereignty on a regular basis. W- uh, uh, n number of times. You can count it, but the number will be great. So if this violation was being done by the navy, it would have a certainly it would have a different image. And if the same thing is done by coast guard, it is just it does is it just does not have the same nature of image or same nature of impact which if it would be done by the coast guard. So uh, by using the by expediting its coast guard, the China has basically taken a step in this direction only, that even if it exerts pressure, you cannot claim that it's a war or anything like that. Thank you.
One more question from our YouTube channel from Mr. Uttam Kumar. Since you have discussed about the various reform undertaken by the CCG to come under CMC, so have they now become a full-fledged war-fighting force of the PLA in case of war breaks out in the sea? Thank you.
See, thank you. Nice question, I would say. So what I can say is that the Coast Guard, as China claims, is a civilian agency. But if we see, the overall command lies with CMC, the Central Military Commission. And also, I would like to say that the the chief of US Navy in 2019 mentioned this, that the way the reforms are being carried on in the Chinese Coast Guard in 2018, we would now consider the Coast Guard of China as well as the maritime militia at par with PLA Navy. So it will only, as of now, we other nations, or let's say China or other littoral states, have not started to claim that the activities being carried on by the Coast Guard or maritime militia are military in nature. But if if the things go in the way they are going, it will definitely in future be called as the mm, military activity. Not the way it has been strengthened, the Coast Guard, it resembles more closer to the military setup than to the civilian setup. Thank you.
Anything else, Bhageshwari?
No.
Okay. Would you like to add, Dr. Thakur, anything further on this?
Thank you, sir. I can just say that the Coast Guard is framed in such a way, or is structured in such a way, that its mandate lies in the civilian domain rather than military domain. And the way changes are being done or restructuring is being done in the Chinese Coast Guard, it becomes uh, very peculiar to whether to term it as a military or or a civilian setup. And the same is the case with maritime militia. It's not very streamlined. The authorities say that they do have control over the whole of setup, but the other littoral states or other powers, regional powers, other extra regional powers have mentioned that it's not possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thakur, and for giving us a good overview of the Chinese Coast Guard and how it's shaping up, how it's becoming a part of the larger maritime forces that the China is developing and has developed, and it is now one of the principal maritime powers in the world now, competing with the United States of America in that respect. And so this is a very important topic, because a lot of times, when we are discussing the Chinese maritime setup, we tend to focus on the Navy itself, which of course is now more than 350 Navy ship. So we tend to ignore the Coast Guard, which has a very crucial role to play in the entire, and especially with the South China Sea and East China Sea being the hotspot. The Coast Guard will play an increasing role in the entire setup, uh, with claims and counterclaims in the region. The is an important player, definitely. The Coast Guard may not come into the Indian Ocean as such, which that jurisdiction rests with the Chinese Navy. But definitely, it will play a larger role in the area, which is now the focus of the global security community. And especially when you're looking at the Indo-Pacific, the Quad is looking at, Quad will definitely be interested in, keeping a close eye on what the Chinese Coast Guard is up to in that sense, and, the other maritime militia forces of China. So thank you so much again, and thank you so much ICS for holding this lecture. I hand you over to Bhagyashri now.
Thank you, sir. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we conclude the session and express our gratitude to Dr. Thakur and Dr. Bhardwaj for taking time out of their busy schedules and sharing their time with us. Today's discussion video will be accessible on the ICS YouTube platform. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled Teaching Chinese to the World, the Political Economy of the Confucius Institutes. Details about the events can be found on the ICS website, or you can subscribe to our newsletters for timely updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye, ICS. Bye.